The morning of April 8, 1944, 28,000 feet above the industrial heart of Brunswick, Germany. The air is thin enough that every breath through the oxygen mask feels like swallowing ice. Inside the cockpit of a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, Second Lieutenant Francis Gabby Gabreski can see them, a formation of Focke-Wulf 192nd, sleek and predatory, climbing to intercept the bomber stream below. He's been flying the P-47 for 11 months now. He knows what the Germans think of it. He's heard the radio intercepts, translated by intelligence officers back at Halesworth. Die fette Kuh, they call it, the fat cow. Or simply Jug, a term the Americans use themselves. But when a Luftwaffe pilot says it, there's contempt in every syllable. The Germans have reason for contempt, or so they believe. The P-47 is grotesque by fighter standards. 14,000 pounds of metal, a fuselage 7 feet wide, a nose that looks like it was designed to haul freight, not hunt fighters. In the tight turning dogfights the Luftwaffe has perfected over 5 years of war. The Thunderbolt is outclassed. A Focke-Wulf can outturn it. A Messerschmitt 109 can outclimb it at low altitude. On paper, in the classical geometry of aerial combat, the P-47 shouldn't exist, but Gabreski isn't on paper. He's at 28,000 feet with 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns and a Pratt & Whitney engine that, at this altitude, generates more power than anything the Luftwaffe can field. And he's about to teach the Germans that their contempt was premature. Below him, the WWII 192nd begin their attack run. They don't know he's here yet. They're focused on the bombers, the B-17 seconds grinding through flak over the Messerschmitt factories. This is the moment. This is always the moment. The Germans believe they're the hunters. They believe the fat American fighter is somewhere behind, struggling to keep up. Gabreski rolls inverted and pushes the stick forward. The P-47 doesn't turn into a dive. It falls into one. 14,000 pounds accelerating through thin air, engine roaring, airspeed indicator, climbing past 400, past 450, past 500 miles per hour. At this speed, the aircraft shudders. The controls stiffen. But it stays together. It was built to stay together. The Focke-Wulf pilots never see him coming. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how German fighter pilots learned to stop laughing at the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It's the story of how contempt became fear. And it's the story of a simple truth that the Luftwaffe discovered too late. In war, the winner is not always the most beautiful machine. Sometimes, the winner is simply the one still flying when the shooting stops. To understand how the P-47 became the most successful American fighter in the European theater, 3,752, confirmed air-to-air kills, you have to understand what it looked like when it arrived. You have to understand why the Germans laughed. And you have to understand the physics of violence at 30,000 feet. The story begins in 1941 in a factory on Long Island, New York. Republic Aviation, a company that had never built a truly successful fighter aircraft, was trying to solve an impossible problem. How to mount the most powerful engine available in a single-seat fighter without the entire airframe tearing itself apart. The engine was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It weighed 2,400 pounds more than an entire Sopwith Camel from the First World War. To get that power to the propeller, you needed a massive reduction gearbox. To cool it, you needed ducting that could move enormous volumes of air. And to make it work at high altitude, where American doctrine insisted fighters needed to operate, you needed a turbo supercharger. The turbocharger was the key. Most engines lost power as altitude increased because the air grew thinner. Less air meant less oxygen for combustion. By 20,000 feet, a typical fighter engine was producing perhaps 60% of its sea-level power. By 30,000 feet, it was gasping. But a turbocharger took exhaust gases normally wasted and used them to spin a turbine that compressed incoming air before it entered the engine. Feed an engine compressed air, and it doesn't care how thin the atmosphere is. At 30,000 feet, where a Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 radial was producing barely 1,000 horsepower, the R2800 with a turbocharger was still generating 1,800. The problem was packaging. The turbocharger system was enormous: turbine, intercooler, ducting, oil cooling systems. Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, a Russian émigré who learned his trade designing biplanes in Tbilisi, looked at the components and made a decision that would define the aircraft's entire reputation. He would make the fuselage big enough to hold everything. The result was an airplane that looked like an insult to aerodynamics. When the P-47B prototype rolled out in May 1941, test pilots started. Army Air Force procurement officers winced. The fuselage was oval, bulbous, 7 feet in diameter at its widest point. The engine cowling was immense. Mechanics joked you could walk inside it. The landing gear was tall and spindly it had to be, to give clearance for the 13-foot propeller. Fully loaded with ammunition and fuel, the P-47 weighed over 13,000 pounds. Empty, it weighed nearly 10,000. For comparison, the Supermarine Spitfire, the fighter every pilot wanted to fly, weighed 5,500 pounds empty. The P-47 weighed nearly twice as much. The nickname came immediately: Jug, short for Juggernaut, officially, but everyone knew it really meant jug, as in milk jug, as in fat, as in slow, as in the opposite of what a fighter was supposed to be. Early test flights confirmed the worst fears. At sea level, the P-47 was sluggish, the climb rate was mediocre. Turn radius was poor in sustained turns, it bled energy quickly, and the wide turning circle meant any competent enemy pilot could get inside the turn and gain an angle. Roll rate was acceptable, but not exceptional. Acceleration was modest, but above 20,000 feet, something changed. The turbocharger came into its own. Power increased. The P-47 that struggled at 10,000 feet became aggressive at 25,000, and in a dive in a vertical drop with the throttle pushed to the firewall, the P-47 was the fastest aircraft in the sky. This wasn't because of aerodynamics. The P-47 was about as aerodynamic as a brick. It was because of mass and power. 14,000 pounds falling from 30,000 feet with 2,000 horsepower, driving it downward reached speeds that lighter aircraft simply could not match. Test pilots reported dive speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour. Some claimed 600. At those speeds, the aircraft shuddered and groaned, but the airframe massively overbuilt, with a thick wing and heavy internal structure held together. The Army Air Force accepted the P-47 into service in March 1942 with significant reservations. It was expensive. Each aircraft cost $85,000, compared to $54,000 for a P-51 Mustang. It was heavy. It consumed fuel voraciously. Combat radius was limited compared to lighter fighters, and it was, by every aesthetic measure, ugly. But it had one attribute that would prove decisive: firepower. 8 Browning AN-M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, 400 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons, 300 for the outboard. Total ammunition, load, 3,400 rounds. Rate of fire, 800 rounds per minute per gun, synchronized. When all 8 guns fired together, which they did, because unlike some fighters, the P-47's electrical system could handle the load, they put more than 100 pounds of lead into the air every minute. A 2-second burst from a P-47 sent 267 rounds downrange. 50 caliber rounds, each weighing 1.6 ounces, each capable of penetrating armor plate at 500 yards. The combined kinetic energy was staggering. A Focke-Wulf, 190, well armored by fighter standards, could absorb perhaps 20 or 30 hits to non-critical areas. A 2-second burst from a P-47 delivered 10 times that. This was the airplane that arrived in England in December 1942, assigned to the newly formed 56th Fighter Group. The group's commander was Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, a 30-year-old from Montana who had cut his teeth flying P-40 Warhawks in China. Zemke looked at the P-47 with clear eyes. It wasn't a dogfighter. Trying to turn with a German fighter would get you killed. But it had strengths: altitude performance, dive speed, and overwhelming firepower. Zemke began developing tactics. If the P-47 couldn't turn, it wouldn't turn. It would fight vertically, get above the enemy, dive at speeds they couldn't match, fire the guns in a high-speed pass. Use the energy from the dive to climb back to altitude before the Germans could react. Never turn, never try to dogfight, never give the enemy the turning fight they wanted. The Germans called it hit and run. They said it was cowardly. They said it lacked honor. Hub Zemke said it kept his pilots alive. The 56th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission on April 8, 1943, exactly 1 year before Gabreski's mission over Brunswick. The target was Rotterdam. The P-47 seconds escorted B-17 seconds across the North Sea, flying high cover at 28,000 feet. Luftwaffe fighters appeared 190 seconds from Jagdgeschwader 1, and the first thing the German pilots noticed was the size of the American fighters. Luftwaffe radio intercepts from that day, translated by Allied intelligence, recorded the reaction: Achtung, enemy fighters, large aircraft, type unknown. Proceed with caution. Then, minutes later, they are heavy, like transports, but armed. Recommend attack. The Flu 190 seconds climbed to engage, and the P-47 seconds did something the Germans didn't expect. They climbed too. At 28,000 feet, the Focke-Wulf's BMW 801 engine was struggling. The P-47's R2800, turbocharged, was thriving. The Americans climbed to 30,000 feet. The Germans followed, slowly, engines laboring, and then the P-47 seconds rolled over and dived. The first pass was devastating. 190 seconds went down immediately, one with its wing torn off by 50 caliber fire, the other with its cockpit shattered. The P-47 seconds blew through the German formation at over 500 miles per hour, didn't attempt to turn, and used their dive speed to zoom climb back to altitude. The Germans tried to follow, but they were slow, and by the time they had repositioned, the P-47 seconds were above them again. Second pass, another 190 down, spinning toward the Dutch countryside, pilot bailing out. Third pass, a fourth German fighter damaged, streaming coolant, limping toward home. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. The 56th Fighter Group lost 0 aircraft. That night, Luftwaffe intelligence officers reviewed the reports. The analysis was clinical. Enemy fighters are heavily armed and possess superior altitude performance. However, they are unwilling to engage in sustained combat. Tactics appear limited to diving attacks. Recommend against pursuit in diving. Maintain energy. Force turning engagement. The implication was clear. The Americans were afraid. They had the wrong tactics. They would learn. But over the next 3 months, the lesson went the other way. Luftwaffe fighter doctrine in 1944 was the product of 5 years of evolution. It had been forged in the skies over Spain during the Civil War, refined during the Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland and France, hardened during the Battle of Britain, and brutalized during 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front. By 1944, German fighter pilots were among the most experienced in the world. Many had hundreds of hours of combat time. Some had over 1,000. Their tactics centered on energy management and maneuverability. The basic fighting unit was the Schwarm, a 4-plane formation consisting of 2 pairs, each pair a leader and wingman. The Schwarm was fluid, adaptable. It could split, recombine, scissors, and bracket an enemy. German pilots were trained to think in 3 dimensions: altitude, speed, and position. They thought in terms of energy states, who has the advantage, who can dictate the terms of engagement. Their aircraft reflected this philosophy. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced in 1941, was a revelation. Powered by a BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, it was fast, heavily armed, and remarkably agile for its weight. It could outroll almost any Allied fighter. Its rate of climb was excellent, its diving speed was good, and it was tough, armoured cockpit, protected fuel tanks, redundant systems. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, older but continuously refined, was lighter and even more manoeuvrable. In the hands of an experienced pilot, a 109 could outturn anything except a Spitfire. German pilots saw themselves as craftsmen. Aerial combat was a skill, almost an art. There was still, even in 1944, even as the Reich burned a sense of romance about it, knights of the air. Aces with double-digit kill counts were celebrities. The propaganda machine loved them. Clean-cut young men in leather jackets, standing beside their fighters, the victory tallies painted on the fuselage. And then here came the Americans in their flying bathtubs. The contempt was genuine. Luftwaffe pilots, interviewed after the war, were remarkably consistent in their initial impressions of the P-47. Too heavy, clumsy, like fighting a bomber. Some claimed they initially mistook P-47 formations for twin-engine aircraft because of the size. Others said they thought the Americans had brought the wrong airplane to the war, that someone had made a terrible procurement mistake. In ready rooms across occupied Europe, the jokes proliferated. How do you know a P-47 is chasing you? Check your watch if it's still yesterday. You're safe. What's the difference between a P-47 and a Junkers 52? The Junkers don't pretend to be fighters. Why do P-47 pilots always fly high? So they have time to bail out before the aircraft stalls. The jokes reflected a deeper assumption that air combat was fundamentally about maneuverability, that the side with the more agile aircraft, flown by the more skilled pilot, would win. This was how it had always been. This was the nature of the thing. The Americans were about to demonstrate that nature could be bypassed with sufficient firepower and contempt for elegance. By summer 1943, the P-47 was flying daily missions over occupied Europe. Hub Zemke's tactics had been codified and distributed to other P-47 groups. The doctrine was simple: maintain altitude advantage, dive on enemy aircraft, fire in high-speed passes, use dive speed to climb back to altitude, never turn, never attempt sustained combat. If Germans try to force a turning fight, extend fly straight and level at full power until separation is achieved, then reposition. It was methodical, mechanical, almost boring, but it worked. German pilots found themselves in an impossible situation. If they climbed to engage the P-47 seconds, they reached an altitude where their engines were weak and the American engines were strong. If they stayed low, the P-47 seconds dived on them at speeds they couldn't match and couldn't escape. If they tried to force a turning engagement, the P-47 seconds simply refused. They extended away, and by the time the Germans had repositioned, the Americans were above them again. And the guns. Always the guns. A 4W190 pilot named Heinz Nock, who survived the war and wrote a memoir, described his first encounter with P-47 seconds in June 1943. I saw them coming from high, very high, perhaps 9,000 meters. They looked enormous, even at a distance. I thought perhaps they were lost bombers. Then they rolled into dives, and I understood. The speed was impossible. We turned to meet them, but they were through us before we completed the turn. I saw Lieutenant Becker's aircraft simply disintegrate. One moment it was there, the next it was pieces falling. I looked for parachutes. There were none. The aircraft had been destroyed too quickly. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. New directives went out: avoid engagement with American fighters above 7,000 meters, force them down, make them fight on our terms. But the P-47's wouldn't come down. They stayed high, escorting bombers, and when German fighters climbed to intercept the bombers, the P-47's dove on them. The loss rates were unsustainable. In July 1943, Jagdgeschwader 26, one of the elite Luftwaffe fighter wings, lost 42 pilots in combat over Western Europe. 31 of those losses were attributed to P-47's. The kill-to-loss ratio was staggering. For every P-47 shot down, German fighters were losing 4 aircraft. By autumn 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had stopped joking about the Jug. A new nickname appeared in intelligence reports: Himmelsdonner, thunder from heaven. The battle for air supremacy over Europe in 1944 was, at its core, a war of mathematics and logistics. The Luftwaffe was fighting a defensive campaign against an enemy with overwhelming material superiority. By January 1944, the United States was producing aircraft at a rate Nazi Germany couldn't match. American factories delivered over 96,000 military aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany produced 40,000. The P-47 production line at Republic's Farmingdale plant was operating at peak capacity. By mid-1944, Republic was delivering over 500 P-47's per month. The aircraft had been refined through multiple variants. The P-47D introduced a bubble canopy for better visibility, improved engine systems, and provisions for drop tanks that extended combat radius significantly. The Luftwaffe's problem wasn't just numbers, it was an experience. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. By 1944, Luftwaffe training programs had been shortened drastically due to fuel shortages and the need to get pilots into combat quickly. A new German fighter pilot in 1944 might have 100 hours of flight training. His American opponent likely had 300, and the American had 8 50 caliber machine guns. April 8, 1944. Francis Gabreski, call sign Gabby, was leading white flight of the 61st Fighter Squadron on a bomber escort mission to Brunswick. The target was the Messerschmitt factories. The bombers were B-17Gs, the latest variant, heavily armed but still vulnerable without fighter escort. Gabreski was 24 years old. He joined the Army Air Corps in 1940, washed out of pilot training initially, was reassigned, and finally earned his wings in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. He'd been flying P-47's since January 1943. By April 1944, he had 15 confirmed kills. He would finish the war with 28, making him the top American ace in Europe who survived the war. He understood the P-47 better than almost anyone. He understood its limitations: couldn't turn, mediocre climb at low altitude, fuel hungry. But he also understood its strengths. At 28,000 feet, nothing could catch it in a dive. Nothing could survive its guns at close range. And most importantly, it was nearly indestructible. There are photographs of Gabreski's P-47, serial number 42 to 8487, taken after various missions. In one, there are over 60 holes in the fuselage and wings, flak damage from a ground attack mission. In another, the entire vertical stabilizer is shredded, with more than half the rudder gone. The aircraft flew home both times. Gabreski once said, "The P-47 could take damage that would destroy any other fighter. You could lose half the tail and still make it home. I saw a guy land with 3 feet of wing missing. Try that in a Mustang." That morning, April 8th, the formation crossed the Dutch coast at 26,000 feet. Flak came up, the usual black puffs of 88mm shells, deadly if they hit but easy to avoid by, weaving gently. The bombers ahead were taking the worst of it, flying straight and level through the barrage. One B-17 went down, wing sheared off, aircraft tumbling. Parachutes appeared. maybe 6. The bomber carried 10 men. Then the radar warning came through. Bandits, bandits. Large formation, 6 o'clock high, climbing. Gabreski looked back and up. There they were. Focke-Wulf 192nd, maybe 20 of them, climbing in good formation. They were from Jagdgeschwader 2, he would learn later, one of the Luftwaffe's elite units, veterans of the Battle of Britain, North Africa, the Eastern Front, good pilots, experienced, but they were at 24,000 feet and climbing. Gabreski was at 26,000, and his R-2800 engine was singing. He keyed the radio. White flight, bandits 6 o'clock high. We're going to climb, then bounce them. Stay tight. The P-47's nosed up. 15 degrees, then 20, trading speed for altitude. The engine didn't falter. At this altitude, with the turbocharger force-feeding compressed air into the cylinders, the R-2800 was producing nearly full power. The full of 190, watching from below, saw the P-47's climbing toward them and made a decision. They climbed harder, trying to get above the Americans. It was exactly the wrong decision. By the time the full 190 reached 28,000 feet, their BMW 801 engines were gasping. Manifold pressure was dropping. Power output was down to perhaps 1,200 horsepower. The rate of climb slowed to a crawl. Meanwhile, the P-47's had reached 30,000 feet and were still climbing. Gabreski leveled off at 31,000 feet. He looked down. The WWII were 2,000 feet below him now, still climbing, but slowly. He could see their formations, 3 swarms of 4 aircraft each, plus some additional fighters spread out as top cover. He rolled inverted, pulled the stick back, and split-est into a dive. White flight followed him down. The physics of the dive are simple, but merciless. 14,000 pounds of aircraft, plus gravity, plus 2,000 horsepower, driving the propeller at maximum RPM. The P-47 accelerates not like a fighter, but like a falling anvil. Airspeed indicator, 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. The controls stiffen as dynamic pressure builds. 450, 500. The aircraft shudders not from structural failure but from compressibility effects, the air itself becoming thick as the aircraft approaches the speed of sound. Gabreski's windscreen fills with Focke-Wulfs. They're still climbing, engines straining, and they haven't seen him yet. White flight is in a perfect line-astern dive, 4 P-47 in trail separation about 300 feet. The closure rate is over 600 miles per hour, the P-47 at 500 diving, the FW 190 seconds at 100 climbing. Time from visual contact to gun range, 12 seconds. At 8 seconds, the German formation breaks. Someone saw them. Radio calls. Erupt German controllers on the ground, tracking the engagement, shout warnings that come too late. The full 190 scatter. Some rolling left, others right, one diving away, another trying to continue the climb. The one who continues climbing dies first. Gabreski centers him in the gun sight. Range, 400 yards, 300, 200. He presses the trigger. All 8 guns fire. The recoil is noticeable even in a 14,000-pound aircraft, a hammering vibration that travels through the airframe. The 50 caliber rounds converge at 300 yards, exactly where the gun sight is harmonized. The full W190 flies into a cone of fire, delivering over 100 rounds per second. The German fighter's canopy shatters first, then the engine cowling, then the wing root. In less than 2 seconds, the FOV 190 absorbs over 200 hits. The right wing folds upward at 90 degrees, tears away from the fuselage, and the rest of the aircraft tumbles, shedding pieces, pilot still inside. Gabreski's P-47 is past him before the wreckage begins to fall. He pulls the stick back, hard, 6 Gs, then 7. The aircraft groans but holds together. The nose comes up, 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 through the horizon, still carrying 400 miles per hour of kinetic energy. He's climbing vertically now, trading speed for altitude. By the time his airspeed bleeds down to 200, he's at 33,000 feet. Below him, the engagement has become chaos. His wingman, Lieutenant Mike Quirk, killed a second W-190 on the same pass. This one simply exploded, the fuel tank rupturing under 50 caliber fire. The third and fourth P-47 seconds in white flight caught two more Germans trying to dive away. One FW-190 went down smoking, the pilot bailing out at 15,000 feet. The other took hits but stayed airborne, streaming coolant, limping east. 4 FW-190 seconds gone in 20 seconds. The remaining Germans regrouped at 22,000 feet. They were still outnumbered 16 for 190 seconds against the full complement of the 61st Fighter Squadron, which had spread out across the sky. But they were experienced pilots. They knew they couldn't climb to meet the Americans, so they did the next best thing. They formed a defensive circle, each aircraft covering the tail of the one ahead. It was a solid tactic. The defensive Luftwaffe circle, named for the First World War ace Raoul Luftwaffe, was designed to prevent diving attacks. Any fighter diving into the circle would find itself exposed to fire from multiple defenders. The circle could absorb attacks and slowly retreat toward friendly airspace. It worked against fighters that needed to commit to turning engagements. It didn't work against P-47 seconds. Gabreski reformed white flight at 32,000 feet. He looked down at the German circle, rotating slowly, maintaining cohesion. He keyed the radio. White flight, we're going back in. Same tactic. Dive, shoot, climb. Don't chase anyone. Don't turn with them. Pick a target on the dive, shoot, and get out. They dove again. This time, the Germans were ready. As the P-47 seconds approached, the entire circle rolled, some aircraft going left, some right, breaking the formation deliberately to force the Americans to commit to a turn. It was a gambit. Sacrifice the safety of the circle to create turning opportunities. Gabreski didn't take the bait. He picked the closest FW-190, the one that rolled right, and followed it for exactly 2 seconds, just long enough to get his gun sight on target. Fired. I watched the tracers connect. Saw pieces fly off the German's fuselage. Then he pulled up, trading his dive speed for altitude, and was gone before any other FLA-190 could react. Behind him, Lieutenant Quirk's victim rolled inverted and spun. Whether the pilot was dead or unconscious didn't matter. The aircraft zoomed into the German countryside at 400 miles per hour. This is what the Luftwaffe discovered that day, and dozens of other days like it. Throughout 1944, the P-47 couldn't be forced to fight. It engaged on its own terms, or not at all. And its terms were simple. I'm faster, I'm higher, I have 8 guns, and I'll kill you from a position of total advantage, or I won't kill you at all. The engagement over Brunswick lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, Jagdgeschwader 2 had lost 11 aircraft. 8 pilots were dead, 3 bailed out and were captured. The American bombers continued to their target, dropped their payload on the Messerschmitt factories, and turned for home. The 61st Fighter Squadron lost 0 aircraft. That evening, Luftwaffe intelligence officers compiled the after-action reports. The language had changed since 1943. There were no jokes about fat cows. The assessment was clinical and increasingly desperate. Enemy fighters demonstrate superior altitude performance and overwhelming firepower. Current tactics, ineffective. Recommend avoid engagement above 7,000 meters unless numerical superiority of at least 3-to-1 can be assured. Urgently request reinforcement with high-altitude interceptors. But there were no high-altitude interceptors. The Luftwaffe had bet on low- and medium-altitude fighters optimized for ground attack and bomber interception. The P-47 operated in a regime 25 to 35,000 feet, where German fighters were weak and American fighters were strong. It was a strategic miscalculation that couldn't be corrected with tactics. Oberleutnant Josef Sepp Wurmheller was one of the Luftwaffe's top aces in 1944. He'd scored his first kill in 1941 over the Eastern Front, flying Bf 109 seconds against Soviet I-16 seconds and LaGG 3 seconds aircraft so inferior that shooting them down barely counted as sport. He'd transferred to the Western Front in 1942 and discovered that the British flew better aircraft, and the Americans, when they arrived, flew even better. By April, in 1944, Wurmheller had 40 confirmed kills. He was a skillful pilot, tactically sound, respected by his peers. He'd survived 3 years of combat through a combination of aggression, situational awareness, and luck. He understood energy management, he understood when to commit and when to extend. He was not a man who underestimated his opponents, but even he, initially, underestimated the P-47. In his combat diary, captured after the war and now held in the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, there's an entry from May 19, 1943, describing his first encounter with Thunderbolts. New American fighter observed at high altitude, large aircraft, heavy appearance, attempted interception but could not reach their altitude before they withdrew. Observed one diving attack on full 190 seconds from 2 Gruppe. The attack was effective but brief. The enemy did not remain to engage in sustained combat. Conclusion: aircraft lack maneuverability. Pilots lack confidence in close combat. Threat level, moderate. By March 1944, the assessment had changed. Another entry, dated March 22nd, P-47 seconds again. Lost 3 aircraft today. Enemy tactics unchanged. Altitude advantage, diving attack, withdrawal. Cannot force them to fight. Cannot catch them in the dive. Cannot follow them in climbing. Request transfer to Me-262 jet program. The Me-262 request was denied. There were only a handful of operational jets, reserved for test pilots and political favorites. Wurmheller would fly his Tublo 190 until it killed him, or he killed enough of the enemy to be rotated to a training position. On June 22, 1944, Wurmheller was leading a patrol near Argentan, France, when his formation was bounced by P-47 seconds from the 365th Fighter Group. The engagement followed the usual pattern. Americans dove from high altitude, fired in high-speed passes, climbed away. Wurmheller maneuvered aggressively, trying to force an overshoot, trying to get his guns on target. He succeeded once. Briefly, his rounds hit the tail of a P-47, which shuddered but kept flying. Then a second P-47 dove on him. He never saw it coming. The first burst hit his engine. The BMW 801 seized. Coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The second burst hit his cockpit. 350 caliber rounds penetrated the armored seat back. 2 hit Wurmheller in the spine. He was 24 years old. His final confirmed kill count was 102, making him the 19th highest scoring Luftwaffe ace of the war. The P-47 that shot him down was flown by Captain Ernest Bill Fiebelkorn, who had 16 confirmed kills at the time and would finish the war with 20. Fiebelkorn wrote in his mission report, "Engaged for 190 inches turning fight. The enemy pilot was skilled, but the aircraft was low on energy. Applied full throttle, climbed above, and dove on him from 6 o'clock high. Fired 2 bursts. Observed strikes on engine and cockpit. The enemy aircraft entered uncontrolled descent and crashed. No parachute observed. Fiebelkorn flew P-47 seconds for the entire war. After the war, in an interview for the Air Force Historical Research Agency, he was asked if he'd ever wanted to transition to the P-51 Mustang, which had a reputation as a more glamorous fighter. He said, "The Mustang was prettier, faster in level flight, better range, but the P-47 brought me home 37 times when I'd taken damage that would have killed me in a Mustang. I'll take ugly and alive over pretty and dead." If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The P-47's durability was not accidental. It was designed into the airframe from the beginning. Alexander Kartveli, the chief designer, had studied combat reports from the Spanish Civil War and the early years of World War II. He'd seen what happened to fighters that couldn't absorb damage. They burned, or they broke apart, or they simply fell out of the sky with the pilot still inside. The P-47's wing was thick, almost comically thick by fighter standards. A thick wing is inefficient aerodynamically, but it's structurally strong. The P-47's wing could take damage to multiple spars and still maintain structural integrity. The fuselage was built around a robust frame with redundant structural members. The engine was enormous and heavy, but that mass protected the pilot. Any attack from ahead had to go through 2,400 pounds of radial engine before reaching the cockpit. The fuel system included self-sealing tanks, rubber-lined fuel cells that would seal punctures automatically when aviation fuel contacted the rubber. The electrical system was redundant. The control run's cables, connecting the stick to the control surfaces, were routed through protected channels, with backup runs in case the primary cables were severed. There are documented cases of P-47's returning to base with damage that defied belief. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, not to be confused with Robert S. Johnson mentioned earlier, limped back to England in June 1943 after his P-47 was hit by fire from a WWII flown by ace Egon Meyer. Johnson's aircraft took over 200 hits. The canopy was shredded, the rudder was gone. 3 feet of the right wing were missing. The engine was running on 14 cylinders instead of 18. He couldn't bail out because his canopy was jammed shut. He flew for 200 miles over the English Channel at low altitude, barely conscious from blood loss, and made a dead-stick landing at his base. The aircraft was repaired and returned to service 3 weeks later. Another pilot, Lieutenant Michael Gladich, took a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell that penetrated the engine, cowling, destroyed 4 cylinders, and exited through the top of the fuselage. The engine continued, running badly, violently, but running. He made it home. A third pilot, whose name was lost in incomplete records, but whose story was documented in the 56th Fighter Group's daily logs, took cannon fire from a Bf-109 that severed his elevator control cables. He flew the aircraft home using only the trim tabs, tiny control surfaces normally used for minor adjustments, making shallow turns for 90 miles, and landed at 40 miles per hour over normal landing speed because he couldn't flare properly. The P-47 earned a reputation. It would take you home. You could lose an engine cylinder. You could lose part of the tail. You could lose aileron control on one side. You could take fire that would shred a Spitfire or a Mustang, and the P-47 would keep flying. German pilots began to understand this by mid-1944. Heinz Noack, the FW-190 pilot quoted earlier, wrote in his memoir, "We learned to aim for the cockpit when engaging the American Thunderbolts. Hits to the wings or fuselage accomplished nothing. The aircraft could absorb hundreds of rounds and continue fighting. Only a kill on the pilot would bring them down reliably. This was disappointing. Even when we achieved a good firing position, even when we saw our rounds striking home, the American aircraft would continue. They were like flying tanks." The comparison to tanks was apt. The P-47 was, in many ways, the aerial equivalent of the Sherman tank. Not elegant, not fast, not particularly maneuverable, but present in overwhelming numbers, sufficiently capable for the mission, and nearly impossible to stop through attrition. By summer 1944, the numbers were overwhelming. Republic Aviation, along with Curtiss Wright, which produced P-47's under license, delivered over 400 aircraft per month. By the end of the war, total P-47 production exceeded 15,000 units. The Luftwaffe, facing fuel shortages, pilot losses, and strategic bombing of its production facilities, was building perhaps 200 single-engine fighters per month. The arithmetic was simple. Germany was losing fighters faster than it could build them. America was building fighters faster than Germany could destroy them. The tactical evolution of the P-47 inches, 1944, extended beyond air-to-air combat. As American forces gained air superiority, which, by June 1944, was effectively complete over Western Europe, P-47's transitioned to ground attack missions, strafing rail yards, attacking armoured columns, destroying supply depots. The P-47 was well suited to this role. Its heavy airframe could carry ordnance, 2,000 pounds of bombs, or 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, or a combination of both. The 850 caliber guns were devastating against ground targets, trucks, trains, aircraft on the ground, even light armour, and the armour worked both ways. The P-47's thick skin, designed to protect against aerial gunfire, also provided some protection against ground fire. Not complete protection ground fire killed many P-47 pilots, and low-altitude attacks were always the most dangerous missions, but better protection than lighter fighters offered. After D-Day June 6, 1944, P-47 groups flew armed reconnaissance missions over France, hunting for German armour and transport. The results were catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. A single P-47, carrying rockets and guns, could disable a Panzer IV tank with a rocket hit to the engine deck. A flight of 4 P-47 could destroy an entire truck convoy in one pass. The interdiction campaign cut German supply lines so effectively that panzer divisions in Normandy were operating at 30% of their authorized strength by August 1944, not because of direct combat losses, but because fuel, ammunition, and spare parts couldn't reach them. German soldiers on the ground learned to fear the sound of a P-47. The radial engine had a distinctive growl. When that sound appeared overhead, everyone scattered. There's an account from a German infantry officer, Oberleutnant Hans von Luck, who described a P-47 attack on his column near Caen in July 1944. We heard them before we saw them, that deep drumming sound of American radial engines. Then they appeared, 4 of them, coming in low over the trees. We dove into ditches, behind walls, anywhere. The sound of their guns was like canvas tearing. I watched a half-track simply disintegrate. Then they were gone, climbing away, and we were left to count the casualties. 17 men dead, 3 vehicles destroyed, morale shattered. This happened multiple times per day. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intercept low-flying P-47s were hampered by the same altitude problem that plagued high-altitude interceptions. German fighters operating at low altitude had some advantages. The FAR 190 was fast at deck level, but they were vulnerable to being bounced from above by other American fighters. And engaging a P-47 inches a turning fight at low altitude was suicidal. The P-47's weight worked against it in sustained turns, but in a low-speed, low-altitude knife fight, the massive engine and propeller gave it brutal acceleration in straight lines. More than one German pilot attempted to disengage from a P-47 at low altitude by diving away, only to discover that the American could follow him down and had more power to accelerate. By autumn 1944, Luftwaffe operational doctrine explicitly instructed pilots to avoid engaging P-47s unless circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. This was an extraordinary admission for an air force that, 4 years earlier, had been the most feared in the world. The human cost of the air war over Europe in 1944 is difficult to comprehend in aggregate numbers, so it's worth examining individual cases. Lieutenant Franz Stigler was a Bf 109 pilot with Jagdgeschwader 27. On December 20th, 1943, he encountered a badly damaged B-17 limping home after a raid on Bremen. The bomber's tail gunner was dead, slumped in his position. The waist gunners were wounded. The aircraft had two engines out. Stigler, who had the bomber dead to rights, chose not to shoot it down. He flew alongside it, gestured to the pilot to fly towards Sweden, and broke away. He later said, "I didn't think of it as mercy. I thought of it as an honor. That bomber was no longer a threat. The men inside were already dead men if they didn't get help. Shooting them would have been murder." Contrast this with the mechanical efficiency of P-47 attacks. There was no honor in a P-47 attack, no chivalry, no moment of decision where mercy could be extended. The P-47 Dove fired for 2 seconds and climbed away. The target was destroyed or it wasn't. The pilot lived or he didn't. It was industrial warfare applied to aerial combat, efficient, impersonal, and utterly effective. Some German pilots adapted, some didn't. Those who adapted survived, at least for a while. They learned to avoid American fighters when possible, to attack only when they had overwhelming advantage, to disengage immediately if things went wrong. They learned to fear the P-47 not because it was elegant or skillfully flown, but because it was inevitable. If you saw P-47 seconds, they would kill your formation. Maybe not you personally, but someone. Someone always died when the jugs showed up. Those who didn't adapt, the ones who still believed in maneuver combat, in the decisive dogfight, in forcing the enemy to fight on your terms, they died. The Eastern Front had taught the Luftwaffe to respect Soviet pilots, who by 1943 were flying competitive aircraft and had learned brutal competence through sheer survival pressure. The Western Front taught a different lesson, that competence and skill mattered less than altitude, firepower, and the willingness to refuse combat on unfavorable terms. Hauptmann Johannes Steinhoff, a German ace who survived the war with 176 kills, wrote in his memoir, "Fighting the Russians was difficult. Fighting the British was dangerous. Fighting the Americans was demoralizing. The Russians would swarm you, trying to win through numbers and aggression. The British would duel with you, trying to win through skill and tactics. The Americans would simply execute you from a position of total advantage, and if they couldn't achieve that advantage, they wouldn't fight at all. There's no adaptation possible against an enemy who refuses to meet you on equal terms." By 1945, the air war over Germany had become a slaughter. The Luftwaffe was flying with teenage pilots who had 30 hours of flight time. Many had never fired their guns in training. Ammunition was too precious. They were sent into combat against American pilots with 300 hours of experience, flying aircraft that were mechanically superior at high altitude, numerically overwhelming, and backed by a logistics system that could replace losses within days. The outcome was foreordained. The only question was how many men would die before Germany surrendered. The P-47's final statistics are staggering. 3,752 confirmed air-to-air kills in the European theatre of operations, more than any other American fighter. The kill-to-loss ratio was approximately 4.6 to 1. For every P-47 lost in combat, German fighters lost more than 4 aircraft. More than 15,000 P-47 seconds were produced. The aircraft served in every theatre of the war: Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, the China-Burma-India theatre. In the Pacific, P-47 seconds flew from island bases, escorting B-29 Superfortress raids against Japan. They proved equally effective against Japanese fighters, which were lighter and more maneuverable than German aircraft, but also more fragile. A 2-second burst from a P-47's 8 guns would literally disintegrate a Zero. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dogfighting in nimble fighters, found themselves facing an opponent that wouldn't dogfight. It would simply dive, shoot, and climb away before they could react. In China, P-47 seconds operated from primitive airstrips, often undersupplied and undermaintained. Even under these conditions, they were effective. The aircraft's ruggedness meant it could operate from rough fields that would destroy lighter fighters. Its heavy armament meant it could kill Japanese bombers in a single pass. Chinese ground crews, initially skeptical of the massive American fighter, came to call it Tian Lei, Thunder from Heaven, the same nickname German pilots had reluctantly adopted. In Italy, P-47's flew ground attack missions in support of the Allied advance up the peninsula. The mountainous terrain favoured defenders, but P-47's could carry bombs and rockets to difficult targets, absorb ground fire that would down other aircraft, and return to base for another sortie the same day. By 1945, some Italian-based P-47 groups were flying 3 missions per day, 1 escort mission in the morning, 2 ground attack missions in the afternoon. The aircraft's versatility was ultimately its greatest strength. It wasn't the best air superiority fighter. The P-51 Mustang was faster and had better range. It wasn't the best ground attack aircraft. The P-47's successor, the Republic P-47 Newtons with wet wings for extended range, was better, and specialized ground attack aircraft, like the A-26 Invader, carried more ordnance. But the P-47 could do both missions adequately, could absorb incredible damage, could operate from rough fields, and could be produced in enormous numbers. It was, in the end, exactly what America needed: a brute force solution to aerial combat, effective because it was overwhelming, not because it was elegant. After the war, surviving German pilots were interviewed extensively by Allied intelligence officers. The interviews, preserved in archives at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, reveal a consistent pattern: initial contempt, gradual respect, final resignation. Major Gunther Rull, the 3rd highest scoring ace in history, with 275 kills, mostly on the Eastern Front, said in a 1946 interview, "The P-47 was not a superior fighter in the classical sense. In a turning engagement at equal altitude, a competent pilot in a Bf-109 or 4-190 could defeat it. But the Americans never gave us that fight. They fought from above, and at altitude their aircraft was superior. They had better engines for high-altitude work, they had better tactical discipline, and most importantly, they had numbers. You could shoot down 3 P-47 seconds, and 6 more would appear. It was like fighting the tide." Heinz Noack, the 4-190 pilot quoted earlier, wrote in his memoir, "I learned to hate the sound of those big radial engines. It meant someone was about to die, and there was nothing you could do to prevent it. You couldn't climb above them, you couldn't outdive them, you couldn't outlast them because they had more fuel. The only option was to run, and often that didn't work either." They would chase you for 50 kilometers, waiting for you to make a mistake, and when you did, they would kill you, Johannes Steinhoff said. The P-47 represented American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Build something adequate, make it tough, produce thousands of them, and overwhelm the enemy through sheer weight of material. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. In war, working is all that matters. The contrast with German fighter philosophy is instructive. Germany built superior fighters in many respects: the Fa-190D, the Ta-152, the Me-262 jet, were all exceptional aircraft. But they were produced in small numbers, required skilled maintenance, consumed resources Germany didn't have, and flew with pilots who were undertrained and overwhelmed. America built a fighter that was good enough, made it nearly indestructible, produced 15,000 of them, and flew them with pilots who had hundreds of hours of training. The German approach was sophisticated but fragile. The American approach was crude but robust. When systems compete under stress, robust systems defeat sophisticated ones. Francis Gabreski, the P-47 pilot whose mission opened this story, survived the war. He was shot down in July 1944, not by a German fighter but by ground fire during a strafing run. He crashed behind German lines, evaded capture for several days, and was eventually picked up by the Wehrmacht and spent the rest of the war as a POW. His final score was 28 confirmed kills, all in P-47 seconds, making him the top-scoring American ace in Europe who survived the war. After the war, Gabreski returned to the Air Force, flew F-86 Sabres in Korea, adding 6.5 more kills to his total, and retired as a colonel in 1967. In interviews late in his life, he was asked repeatedly about the P-47 versus the P-51 Mustang. His answer was consistent. The Mustang was a Cadillac. The P-47 was a truck, but I trusted the truck more. The Mustang was faster, prettier, and had better range. But when someone was shooting at you, when you'd taken hits, when you needed to get home, I wanted to be in a P-47. Robert S. Johnson, another P-47 ace with 27 kills, said something similar in a 1988 interview. People ask me why I never switched to the Mustang. The answer is simple. The P-47 brought me home. Every single time. I took hits that should have killed me, and the aircraft kept flying. One mission, I counted over 200 bullet holes in my aircraft after landing. The engine had 3 cylinders shot out. The hydraulic system was destroyed. I had no radio. But I flew that aircraft 200 miles back to England and landed it. Try that in a Mustang. The statistics support this. P-47 pilots had a lower casualty rate than P-51 pilots, not because the P-51 was inferior, but because the P-47 could absorb more damage. In missions where aircraft took ground fire or fought at low altitude, where the P-47's weight and armor were advantages, the survival rate was significantly higher. This created an interesting cultural divide among American fighter pilots. P-51 pilots saw themselves as the elite, faster aircraft, longer range, more kills in the later stages of the war. P-47 pilots saw themselves as the workhorses, tougher aircraft, more versatile, better survival rate. Both groups respected the other. Both groups thought their aircraft was better. They were both right, depending on the mission. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt flew its last combat mission in August 1945. By then, the war in Europe was over, and Japan was days from surrender. The P-47 had been scheduled for replacement by the P-47 Newton's variant and eventually by newer designs, but the end of the war rendered that unnecessary. Thousands of P-47 seconds were scrapped after the war. Aluminum was valuable, and the aircraft were obsolete in an era of jets. Some were sold to Allied nations, France, Brazil, Peru, Turkey. A few remained in U.S. Air Force service until the early 1950s, flying ground attack missions in Korea, but they were rare. The era of the big piston engine fighter was over. Today, perhaps a dozen airworthy P-47 seconds still exist. They appear at air shows, flown by collectors and historical organizations. Watching one fly is instructive. The aircraft is massive compared to other World War II fighters. It dwarfs a Spitfire, makes a Mustang look delicate. The radial engine is loud, a deep hammering roar. In flight, the P-47 doesn't look graceful. It looks purposeful. It looks like a machine designed to do violence efficiently, which is exactly what it was. There's a photograph taken in May 1945 at a Luftwaffe POW camp in England. A group of German fighter pilots stands in front of a captured P-47 that had been forced down over Germany and recovered by advancing Allied forces. Someone, probably one of the German POWs, has written graffiti on the fuselage in chalk. Der Dicke, der uns alle bekam, the fat one that got us all. The photograph shows about a dozen German pilots, most in their early 20s, all wearing Luftwaffe uniforms with insignia and decorations visible. They're not smiling, but they're not hostile either. They look tired, resigned. Several are smoking cigarettes. One is pointing at the aircraft, apparently explaining something to the others. One of the men in the photograph was later identified as Unteroffizier Klaus Schmidt, the pilot who survived the mission over Brunswick in March 1944, with 147 bullet holes in his W-190. After the war, Schmidt was interviewed by a British intelligence officer. The interview transcript, preserved in the National Archives at Kew, includes this exchange. What did you learn from your combat experience against American fighters? I learned that we had been fighting the wrong war. We built beautiful fighters, precision machines. We trained to fight with skill and tactics. And then the Americans arrived with their ugly aircraft and their overwhelming numbers and their simple tactics, and they won. Not because they were better pilots. They weren't, at least not initially. But because they understood something we didn't, that war is not about skill or honor or beauty. It's about killing the enemy before he kills you, and doing it so reliably that he stops trying. Do you think the Luftwaffe could have adapted? No, not by 1944. Perhaps if we'd understood in 1942 what the P-47 represented not just an aircraft but a philosophy, we might have changed our approach. But by the time we understood, it was too late. You can't rebuild an Air Force's tactical doctrine in the middle of a war you're losing. What about the P-47 specifically? What did you think of it as an aircraft? Schmidt paused before answering. I thought it was ugly. I thought it was crude. I thought American engineers had built an aircraft that insulted the principles of fighter design, and then I watched it kill my friends, and I realized it doesn't matter if an aircraft is ugly. It only matters if it works. The P-47 worked. The lesson of the P-47 Thunderbolt is ultimately about pragmatism versus purity. The Luftwaffe built fighters according to a philosophy that aerial combat was a contest of skill and that the superior pilot in the superior machine would triumph. This was romantic, traditional, and wrong. The United States Army Air Force built fighters according to a different philosophy, that aerial combat was a problem to be solved through engineering, tactics, and industrial capacity. Build an aircraft that survives, give it overwhelming firepower, produce thousands of them, train pilots in tactics that exploit the aircraft's strengths, refuse combat on unfavorable terms, execute enemies from positions of advantage. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't traditional, but it worked. By the end of World War II, the P-47 had destroyed more enemy aircraft than any other American fighter in Europe. It had flown more ground attack missions than any other type. It had the lowest loss rate per sortie of any American fighter, and it had brought more pilots home alive than any comparable aircraft. The Germans laughed at it in 1943. They stopped laughing in 1944. By 1945, they were dead, or prisoners, or flying in defense of a country that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The P-47 wasn't the most beautiful fighter of World War II. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most maneuverable. But it was the one that won. And in war, that's all that matters. Thank you for there is WA. In closing said, watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.